Superstorm Sandy set us all up. It's a great example. Wonderful news story. Prime example of something that gives us lots to write about, lots to talk about, lots to take action about. And then the question is, are we doing anything? Are we really moving forward? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk, it's a great segue, Patty set me up. I'm going to talk about it from the built environment side, what's going on with sea level rise. So I'm an urban planner. I've been planning for 25, 30 years in the Washington State area. My area has been in coastal issues. So I have been looking at our shorelines over the years from a variety of perspectives, and sea level rise and climate change is just one of the many issues that we find that we have to address in Washington State. I'm going to take a step backwards. First of all, I want to tell you about Washington Sea Grant, the organization I work for. Then I'm going to give you a bigger picture of the parts and the pieces of planning for climate change and sea level rise. Who are the players? What are the plans? And then I'm going to get to some very specific, here's some action items from the built environment perspective that are going on in the region. I'm going to actually talk about it from mainly Washington, but give some Oregon and BC examples so you get the full region, because I know you all represent that, people from all over that area. So Washington Sea Grant is an organization, and we do research and outreach and education, and we partner then. We're at the university, and we are one of 33 of these in coastal communities, coastal states throughout the United States, including the Great Lakes. And we partner with universities, we partner with local governments, federal governments, state governments, and then we also partner with tribes and partner with industries. Then we come up with, and in our research and education, coming up with useful information that can be a useful source. And so we can provide you, journalists, with information about what's going on in a variety of issues and areas. And just to give you a range of it, we work with healthy coastal ecosystems. Some examples over the years, we've done some really interesting seabird bycatch efforts, trying to reduce the amount of bycatch, training on aquatic invasive species. We've been really involved in the Elwha Dam removal, documentation, and the sedimentation that Patty was talking about. We're also involved in sustainable fisheries and aquaculture. We work with Taylor Seafood and a lot of the shellfish industry. We also work with the seafood industry, safe seafood, seafood handling, marketing, sustainable practices. We work with ocean literacy and workforce development. In that, we have a lot of communication tools, but we also have a lot of training programs. We do a NOAA science camp every summer, an Orca Bowl, and we also have at least six fellows that we place in marine policy places throughout. For example, state agencies. We have them at Puget Sound Partnership and a range of places, marine-related issues. And then the final area is the resilient communities and economies, where that involves a range of things, both non-climate change and climate change. And the climate change types of things are, for example, we've been working with the working waterfronts. We'll train people who work in the fishing industry on marine and marine technologies, clean marinas. We've been involved in oil spill issues. And then when it comes to science, the climate change efforts, these are the issues that we're working on. So we're working on, we're very involved in what you have heard about and will hear about, the ocean acidification, putting together the Blue Ribbon Panel and implementing it, providing stakeholder information and outreach on those issues. We're developing a coastal hazards network for the outer coast of Washington. Ultimately, we've been funded for the outer coast, ultimately probably do inner Puget Sound. We do coastal flood training programs that are sponsored through FEMA, but we do those free in the communities. We've been doing some coastal vulnerability assessments, one that I'll talk about a little bit later, and then also some climate adaptation and tools. So a real wide range of kinds of things, but those are the kinds of things with respect to climate change and sea level rise that we've been specifically doing. So what's the problem? This is the problem from the built environment. Now that you've heard the natural environment, this is a little dated, but the dark blue, this is where people are moving to the coast. From 2003, these are the statistics. Those dark blues are where the large influx of population is, which means, of course, more building built environment. Now, you contrast that with this map that shows you where's the large influx of impact from sea level rise. Pretty much the same places. Florida, New York, Southern California, they're getting hit the worst, and that's where the biggest influx of population is. So we're looking at the perfect storm, pardon the pun, but that's exactly what we're talking about, so why we're having to address this from the built environment side. So you have these gradual changes, this constant erosion and inundation that's taking place, but then you have the sudden, which is the waves, the storm events, the increased, these significant events that are having impact on that built environment. So who are the players? Now I wanted to take a step back again. As a planner, what I'm always interested in is who's involved in the story. And when you're talking about greenhouse gas, it's usually EPA. So that's why I wanted to make sure when you're talking about sea level rise that you have that different perspective. So FEMA is one of the biggest players, and we just usually don't run into FEMA, although of course anybody following Katrina and then now Sandy would know that's where it's at. But they're the big player. They're the big kid on the block because they're the ones with the money, but they're also the ones who are involved in the insurance issues. And so they're really at the heart of when you're talking about sea level rise. The other big player though is NOAA, and they don't show up so much usually in our conversations. But they're the ones who have the grants, the funding, and they're also then responsible for the coastal zone management practice programs that then trickle down to the states where they're doing some of the planning at that coastal level. And then the third big player at the federal level is the Corps of Engineers. And that is a real interesting player because they're the construction side. We think of them with respect to rebuilding, you know, in Louisiana, you think of them rebuilding the dikes, rebuilding the breakwaters. And the question, of course, is should they be rebuilding? What are we putting the money into? What are the alternatives? How are they involved in these variety of activities? And then another big issue is the dredging that they're involved in of our harbors. And they're the ones who fund it and manage it and then also have the permitting responsibility. So well, who are the state level? I'm just going to give you the Washington State perspective. This is the local. So the real key people that you're talking to in Washington State when you're talking about sea level rise and climate change are going to be Department of Ecology, Department of Natural Resources, because they're the managers of state-owned lands. So where there are federal, state-owned tidelands and shorelands, DNR is going to be involved. And then you have Fish and Wildlife. They're responsible for permitting. So as somebody wants to go through a built environment and build something, you need to be in contact with DNR. What role are they taking in addressing some of the impacts of sea level rise? How's that being built into the regulatory regime? And then finally, the Department of Emergency Management. We'll be seeing an increased role because they're involved in floodplains and the hazard planning that I'll be talking about. Then ultimately, it's going to trickle down to those local jurisdictions, and that's kind of where the rubber hits the road, and they're involved, and they have a whole range of regulatory planning and regulatory functions that they're involved in. So what are the planning mechanisms? And this is just a big picture, just so you have some of the buzzwords that you're thinking about when people start to talk about how are we doing the planning that then is going to be implementing some of the things that are going on. And these are the key ones. First of all, and you've heard some of this talked about, and Hedia yesterday talked about climate action planning. There was, first of all, the big statewide effort. And then it's also coming down to the cities and jurisdictions and counties doing their own climate adaptation planning, looking at the whole range of issues, their vulnerability assessments, and then actually, what do we do now we know what's vulnerable in terms of our physical assets. Then the other real key piece in Washington State that's been playing out is our Shoreline Master Program. And we have a very unique program here. I'm not going to go into it in depth. Some of you may already know about it. But anyway, take a 200-foot swath from the edge of the water and go inland. And everything within that 200-foot range is subject to this program. That's a state program. You have to get authorized at the state level, but the local jurisdictions can tweak it to their own liking to fit their jurisdiction, but it has to be approved by the state. So it's a real local state partnership. But that's where sea level rise really can be addressed at the local level, because it's not only a planning tool, it's a regulatory tool. And every time you build something within that 200-foot swath, plus from the edge of the water into the water, you have to get approval locally under that shoreline program. So a lot of sea level rise issues should be addressed at that point. The local jurisdictions are going through the process right now of updating those plans, and there's really a variability of how well they've been addressing sea level rise at that point. I gave some guidance on that. There's more coming out, but I sent that out as part of the packet of information that has to do with that piece. Another big piece in Washington State is our comprehensive plans, and those are just going through an update process. So what we're doing now is looking at whether or not climate change really is going to be involved in local jurisdictions doing anything about that. Two other pieces are hazard mitigation plans, floodplain plans. Those are through emergency management. Again, how well coordinated is all of this? Big question. We really aren't there in Washington State. Other tools, there's a whole range of them. The big one that you probably think about would be your building codes, et cetera. But there's a whole range of other tools in a toolbox that we can use to deal with the shoreline, the sea level rise in our shorelines. Let me quickly jump to Oregon and BC. Very different situation in Oregon. You're talking about outer coast and not the same population. They're not as much dealing with in, say, Portland, but it's that outer coast. And so they have an overall climate plan. They have these overall statewide planning goals. They have not dug down into sea level rise yet to deal with that. They really haven't gotten there. They're more site specific. They've got a hazards network that they've been building. And then also in the town of Nesquequim, it's the one place that really has gone out and done an adaptation study to say, we need to focus on it. This is from an event. Pictures from an event in 2008-9, I believe it was, realizing they need to start addressing this on a more systematic basis of how are they dealing with properties as properties come in for remodeling or renewal. What can you do to address these impacts of increased storm events? BC, totally different story. Their focus has been on rivers and diking and flooding impact. So what they've been doing is developing better guidance for the dikes and the setbacks. This is an example in BC in Richmond. This was done for the Olympics, where the actual line where the original dike was right here along that edge of the water. They pushed it back, and the idea of allowing more room for water to flow in a river system. And that's something that's happening throughout BC. They're starting to look more at the shorelines, but their focus has been primarily on these, the dikes and the rivers. When we're talking about adaptation, you really think about the three main strategies are protect, accommodate, and retreat. So I'm going to give you a couple examples of what's kind of been going on in the Northwest. The seawall, a perfect example. So it's protection. You have to take into account, you can't always accommodate the water. We are going to have to face protection. And there is critical infrastructure we do need to protect. So we need to be thinking, how are we designing our seawall to accommodate sea level rise? And that's a question that's going on right now in New York City as they are rebuilding, for example. What do we have that's the critical infrastructure that we have to protect? City of Olympia, the need for they are very low. They have major infrastructure that they are having to consider protecting, and they've done a lot of work. The red is showing a lot of the infrastructure, the wastewater and their water facilities, all their major infrastructure in this critical area that's subject to flooding. They've been doing years and years of study about what to do about that. At the same time, though, that they've been trying to protect that, they also are designing their Shoreline Master Program that has regulation. So at the same time they're trying to protect their infrastructure, they've gone to the community and said, okay, here are some strategies to address sea level rise and increased storm events, and they're getting real pushback. That the community, so that's sort of a success, not so successful effort that's been going on, where they've got the two issues, critical infrastructure and then how do you allow private property to rebuild? Another real great accommodation story is what the Jamestown tribe and the Swinnomish have been involved in. The Jamestown is the newest, where we've been involved in doing a vulnerability assessment for their community, and then what are the next steps you have to take for accommodation. Similarly, the Swinnomish went through such a same process, 2009, 2010. And in their case, they're looking at, for example, their critical infrastructures, their casinos that are vulnerable in the floodplain. What are they going to be doing? How are they going to be addressing these changes in sea level rise? But the other thing these communities are looking at is their livelihoods, the fishing industry being affected by sea level rise, and how are they going to be accommodating that over time? This is a more extreme, but communities are looking at the impact of those real extreme events. So as we were talking about the outer coast and the shifting of the plates, we're looking at this possibility of tsunamis. Well, tsunami is the extreme case, but even in the case of these storm events, you're talking about a community in Long Beach building a safe haven. Literally, this is a design of what they're talking about, of a place where the community can come in the event of a tsunami. Other things that are starting to happen. Building codes, you know, I said, building codes. So in BC, to address flooding, they're actually now requiring properties to be built 1 meter above the floodplain. So those are design and building code types of things that we're going to start seeing. This is Connecticut. I don't know if any of you had seen some of this coming out of Connecticut as a result of Sandy, that they changed the building codes to require the higher level design of buildings. Then armoring, one of the things that Patty was talking about is the issue of the walls and the artificial shorelines that we've created. This is in an example that's up in Bellingham, where you've rip-wrapped, you've put these big rocks, or whether it's that or a wall, you've cut off the natural process of the shoreline. And not only is it the impact on the habitat, but it also does not help when you've got these increased storm events, and it is not addressing the erosion problem. So what we're doing is we're looking more and more to trying to find natural shores. Living shorelines is a term that they're using on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast. And we are doing a lot of this work in the Northwest of trying to find where we can replace these artificial shorelines with the natural ones. Then there's the final step, which is the ultimate of retreat. And you're hearing about, for example, removing the entire communities in the Marianas. You're hearing some of this in Alaska. Well, the Hoh and the Quileute tribes on the west coast of Washington State actually have been engaged in retreat and removing and moving their entire community, because they know they are susceptible to sea level rise and as climate change is affecting them. So these are examples of the extreme of having to do a retreat type of an action. So what are my final thoughts on where we're going with all of this? It's really a challenge to get people's attention. It's like I started with a slide of Sandy. I mean, that got everybody all excited. But for how long? And does it really take a crisis for us to be starting to take those steps to do anything? I think where we're going to see some of the big changes coming is a push from the insurance industry, because I think that's where the rubber meets the road with the private industry and private property owners saying, why are we building right in these areas that are so vulnerable? And then finally, it's political will. And you've heard that over and over and over again. Who's going to make that hard decision to go forward with a regulation, with a plan, with an implementation that's going to really start making some changes in how we're doing business?